In the autumn of 1855, when the Rocky Mountains still held their secrets close and the gold rush had drawn desperate men to forsaken places, a case emerged that would haunt the territorial records for decades to come. The name Malcolm Hart appeared in 3 separate documents that year: a mining claim registry, a territorial marshal's report, and a letter found sealed in the wall of an abandoned cabin 68 years later. The story begins in Clear Creek County, Colorado Territory, where the South Platte River carved its path through granite and pine. Here, among the scattered mining camps that dotted the landscape like infected wounds, Malcolm Hart had established what locals called a legitimate operation. Hart, a man described in contemporary accounts as methodical and quiet, had filed his claim in the spring of 1855, staking out a section of creek bottom where previous prospectors had found modest success. Unlike the frenzied camps that sprouted overnight around major strikes, Hart's operation maintained an unusual discipline. Witnesses noted his habit of working alone, rarely speaking to fellow miners, except when necessity demanded it. The territorial surveyor's log describes his claim as well organized, with sluice boxes arranged in precise rows and equipment maintained with military precision. This attention to detail would later become significant when investigators attempted to reconstruct the events of that winter. The nearest settlement, a collection of ramshackle buildings known as Prospect Gulch, lay approximately 3 miles downstream from Hart's claim. The community consisted of perhaps 40 souls during peak season, though many would abandon their holdings when winter approached. Store owner Jeremiah Caldwell, whose establishment served as the unofficial gathering place for local miners, kept a crude ledger of transactions. Hart's name appears regularly in these records throughout the summer months, purchasing supplies with mathematical regularity: flour, coffee, lamp oil, and occasionally rope. What distinguished Hart from his contemporaries was not his mining technique or his isolated nature, but rather his apparent prosperity. While most prospectors struggled to extract enough gold dust to cover basic necessities, Hart's weekly trips to Caldwell's store suggested a level of success that bordered on the extraordinary. Fellow miners began to take notice, particularly as winter approached, and their own claims yielded diminishing returns. The first recorded concern about Hart's operation appears in a letter dated September 23, 1855, written by prospector Thomas Whitman to his brother in Kansas. The letter, discovered among family papers in 1923, describes strange sounds emanating from Hart's claim during nighttime hours. Whitman wrote of hearing what he interpreted as machinery operating well past sunset, accompanied by occasional shouts that carried unnaturally far in the thin mountain air. By October, rumors had begun to circulate throughout the scattered camps of Clear Creek County. Miners reported encounters with Hart that left them unsettled, describing a man whose demeanor had shifted from simple reclusiveness to something approaching hostility. Multiple accounts from this period describe Hart's appearance as increasingly disheveled, his clothes stained with substances that seemed inconsistent with ordinary placer mining operations. The territorial marshal's first involvement came through a formal complaint filed by prospector William Beckner on October 15, 1855. Beckner alleged that Hart had threatened him with violence when he attempted to examine what he believed to be an encroachment on his own claim boundary. Marshal Robert Kane's initial report describes Hart as cooperative but evasive, claiming that his success stemmed from superior knowledge of geological formations acquired through years of experience in California mining operations. Kane's investigation revealed discrepancies that troubled him sufficiently to warrant a second visit. Hart's claim showed evidence of excavation far beyond what would be necessary for standard creek bed mining. Mounds of displaced earth formed irregular patterns across the property, and several areas appeared to have been recently covered with fresh soil, despite the lack of ongoing excavation. Most concerning was Hart's reluctance to demonstrate his mining process, claiming that his techniques represented trade secrets too valuable to share. The Marshal's second report, filed November 2nd, 1855, noted Hart's increasing isolation and what Kane described as a noticeable deterioration in his mental state. Hart spoke in disjointed sentences, frequently pausing mid-thought as if listening to sounds that others could not detect. His cabin, previously maintained with the same precision as his mining equipment, showed signs of neglect. Windows remained covered with canvas during daylight hours, and smoke from his chimney produced an acrid smell that differed markedly from ordinary wood burning. As November progressed into December, Hart's weekly supply runs ceased entirely. Caldwell noted in his ledger that Hart's last recorded purchase occurred on December 8th, an unusually large quantity of lamp oil and an item listed simply as miscellaneous hardware. When questioned years later, Caldwell could only recall that the hardware consisted of iron implements whose purpose remained unclear to him. The first snowfall of winter arrived on December 20th, effectively isolating the higher elevation claims until spring. This isolation, which typically lasted 3 to 4 months, provided cover for whatever activities continued at Hart's operation throughout the darkest months of the year. The few miners who remained in the territory reported distant sounds during particularly quiet nights. Rhythmic impacts that seemed to echo from the direction of Hart's claim, accompanied by occasional flashes of light that appeared inconsistent with ordinary lamp usage. Spring's arrival in 1856 brought the first direct evidence that something had gone profoundly wrong at Malcolm Hart's claim. Prospector Daniel Reed, returning early to resume work on his holdings, discovered Hart's cabin abandoned and partially dismantled. The structure's interior had been methodically stripped of all furnishings, with only the basic framework remaining intact. More disturbing was the state of the mining operation itself. Equipment lay scattered and damaged, sluice boxes had been deliberately destroyed, and the carefully organized claim showed evidence of extensive, apparently random excavation. Hart himself had vanished without trace. His belongings, his accumulated wealth, and any record of his activities during the winter months had disappeared entirely. The only items remaining at the site were several iron tools whose purpose baffled investigators and a collection of wooden stakes driven into the ground in patterns that served no apparent mining-related function. Marshal Kane's final report on the Hart case, filed May 15, 1856, concluded that the missing prospector had likely fallen victim to claim jumpers or hostile Indian activity. This explanation satisfied territorial authorities who were dealing with numerous disappearances and violent incidents throughout the region. The official record was closed, and Hart's claim reverted to territorial control. However, unofficial accounts continued to circulate among the mining communities for years afterward. These stories, transmitted through the informal networks that connected scattered camps and settlements, painted a significantly darker picture of Hart's final months. According to these accounts, Hart had discovered something in his excavations that had fundamentally altered his relationship with both his claim and his fellow miners. The most persistent of these stories concerned the period immediately following the first snowfall. Multiple witnesses reported seeing figures moving near Hart's claim during nighttime hours, despite the supposedly impassable conditions. These sightings, initially dismissed as products of isolation and harsh weather, gained credibility when several independent observers provided remarkably consistent descriptions of the phenomena. According to these accounts, the figures moved in organized patterns across Hart's property, apparently conducting some form of systematic activity that continued throughout the winter. Observers noted that the figures appeared to be working with tools that produced distinctive sounds, sharp impacts against stone, followed by what witnesses described as scraping or dragging noises that carried considerable distances in the cold air. The most troubling aspect of these reports concerned the number of figures observed. While Hart had consistently worked alone throughout the summer and autumn months, winter observers reported seeing as many as 6 or 7 distinct silhouettes moving across his claim during periods of activity. The implications of this discrepancy were not lost on those who had known Hart personally, particularly given his documented hostility toward potential partners or assistants. Spring's revelation that Hart had vanished raised immediate questions about the identity and fate of these additional figures. No records existed of anyone joining Hart's operation, and inquiries among the scattered mining community failed to account for any missing individuals who might have been working at the claim during winter months. This mystery deepened when investigators discovered that several prospectors from neighboring areas had departed the region without notice during the preceding autumn, leaving their own claims abandoned and their whereabouts unknown. The territorial authorities' investigation focused primarily on the possibility of Indian attack or bandit activity, both of which were common threats in the region during this period. However, the complete absence of Hart's possessions and the methodical destruction of his mining equipment suggested a level of organization that seemed inconsistent with typical raiding patterns. Most puzzling was the apparent care taken to conceal or remove all evidence of whatever activities had occurred at the site during the winter months. Local residents developed their own theories about Hart's disappearance, theories that reflected both the harsh realities of frontier life and the psychological stress of isolation in an unforgiving environment. Some believed that Hart had struck an extraordinarily rich vein and departed secretly to avoid claim jumpers. Others suggested that he had succumbed to the mental pressures that affected many solitary prospectors, leading to self-destructive behavior that ultimately proved fatal. A third theory, whispered rather than spoken openly, suggested that Hart had become involved with the criminal elements that operated throughout the territory. According to this version of events, his apparent prosperity had attracted the attention of organized gangs who specialized in robbing successful miners. Hart's isolation would have made him an ideal victim for such operations, particularly during the winter months when rescue or intervention would be impossible. The most disturbing theory concerned Hart's own transformation during his final months. Witnesses who had interacted with him during the autumn period described behavioral changes that went beyond ordinary eccentricity. Hart's speech patterns had become increasingly erratic, punctuated by references to discoveries that others could not comprehend. He spoke of finding materials that did not belong in creek bed deposits, substances that seemed to predate the geological formations in which they were embedded. These references initially struck listeners as the products of an untrained mind attempting to interpret complex geological phenomena. However, Hart's descriptions were remarkably specific, focusing on organic materials that he claimed to have extracted from rock layers that should have contained only mineral deposits. His excitement about these discoveries seemed disproportionate to their apparent value, suggesting either a fundamental misunderstanding of geology or knowledge of factors that he chose not to share with others. The investigation into Hart's disappearance officially concluded in late 1856, but unofficial interest in the case persisted for decades. Subsequent prospectors who worked in the area reported finding evidence of extensive excavation that went far beyond what would be necessary for gold extraction. These discoveries included deep shafts that seemed to follow no logical mining pattern, and excavated areas that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of transported soil and vegetation. Most significant was the discovery, in 1864, of a cache of documents hidden beneath the floor of Hart's former cabin. These papers, badly deteriorated but partially legible, appeared to be Hart's personal records of his mining activities during 1855. The documents revealed an obsession with what Hart described as anomalous findings that contradicted his understanding of the region's geological history. Hart's notes described the discovery of organic materials embedded in rock formations that should have been millions of years old. His sketches depicted objects that resembled tools or implements, but crafted from materials and using techniques that seemed inconsistent with known indigenous technologies. Most puzzling were his references to finding these artifacts in positions that suggested they had been deliberately placed or arranged rather than deposited through natural processes. The documents also revealed Hart's growing conviction that his claim occupied a site of unusual historical significance. He wrote of finding evidence of previous excavations, some apparently ancient, others more recent. His notes suggest that he believed multiple groups had worked the area over extended periods, each drawn by discoveries that remained hidden from territorial authorities and fellow prospectors. Hart's final entries, dated in early December 1855, reflected increasing paranoia about outside interference in his work. He wrote of being watched during his excavations and of finding evidence that others had visited his claim during his absences. His tone became increasingly agitated as he described what he interpreted as systematic efforts to monitor his activities and potentially claim credit for his discoveries. The last coherent entry in Hart's journal described his decision to work exclusively during nighttime hours to avoid observation. He wrote of making contact with individuals who shared his interest in the anomalous findings and who possessed knowledge that could help him interpret their significance. However, he provided no identifying information about these individuals, referring to them only as associates who understood the true importance of his discoveries. This final entry concluded with Hart's plan to suspend normal mining activities and focus entirely on what he termed archaeological excavation. He wrote of preparing for an extended period of intensive work that would require careful coordination with his unnamed associates. The entry ends abruptly, with no indication of when or why Hart ceased maintaining his records. The territorial marshal, who reviewed these documents in 1864, concluded that they represented the deteriorating mental state of an isolated individual suffering from what would later be recognized as psychological breakdown. However, several details in Hart's notes correlated with observations made by other prospectors working in the region during the same period, lending unexpected credibility to some of his claims. Multiple independent sources confirmed Hart's assertions about finding unusual organic materials in unlikely geological contexts. Prospectors working downstream from Hart's claim reported discovering fragments of worked wood and what appeared to be fabric materials in creek bed deposits where such items should not naturally occur. These findings were generally dismissed as contamination from more recent human activity, but their consistent appearance in areas that had been undisturbed for decades raised questions about their actual origin. More significantly, several prospectors reported discovering evidence of previous excavations in areas that had been considered virgin territory. These excavations followed patterns that seemed inconsistent with standard mining practices, focusing on areas with little apparent mineral potential while avoiding locations that showed clear signs of gold-bearing deposits. The purposes of these previous excavations remained unclear, but their existence suggested a history of activity in the region that predated the documented arrival of European settlers. The mystery deepened in 1867 when territorial surveyor James Morrison discovered what appeared to be a mass grave while conducting routine boundary assessments near Hart's former claim. The grave contained the remains of at least 6 individuals, all adult males, buried in a manner that suggested hasty concealment rather than formal interment. The remains showed evidence of having been buried for approximately 12 years, placing their burial during the period of Hart's residence in the area. Morrison's discovery prompted a renewed investigation by territorial authorities, but the intervening years had eliminated most potential witnesses and evidence. The few prospectors who remembered Hart's operation could provide little additional information about his activities or associates. The official investigation concluded that the remains were most likely those of unknown prospectors who had fallen victim to the various hazards common to frontier life: exposure, accident, or criminal violence. However, unofficial examination of the remains revealed details that complicated this explanation. The bodies had been buried with systematic precision, arranged in patterns that seemed inconsistent with emergency burial under harsh conditions. More troubling was evidence that the burials had occurred during winter months, when ground conditions would have made excavation extremely difficult without specialized tools and sustained effort. The location of the mass grave, approximately half a mile from Hart's former cabin, suggested careful planning rather than expedient disposal. The site had been chosen to avoid detection, hidden in a natural depression and camouflaged with transported vegetation that would have required considerable effort to arrange. This level of organization implied either extensive local knowledge or prolonged preparation that seemed inconsistent with typical criminal activity in the region. Investigation of territorial records for the relevant period revealed that at least 8 prospectors had been reported missing from the Clear Creek County area during the winter of 1855 to 1856. These men had departed their claims without notice and without leaving forwarding information, a pattern that, while not unprecedented, was unusual in its concentration and timing. Their disappearances had been attributed to various factors: claim jumping, Indian raids, or simple abandonment due to poor prospects. The correlation between these disappearances and Hart's documented presence in the area raised questions about his potential involvement in their fates. However, no evidence existed to suggest direct connections between Hart and any of the missing individuals. Hart's reputation among fellow prospectors had been that of a reclusive but non-violent individual, and no reports of conflicts or threats had been documented in official records. Nevertheless, the temporal and geographic correlation was sufficiently compelling to warrant additional investigation. Territorial authorities conducted interviews with surviving prospectors who had worked in the region during the relevant period, seeking any information about Hart's activities or behavior that might illuminate the circumstances surrounding the disappearances. These interviews revealed a pattern of subtle behavioral changes in Hart during the months preceding the disappearances. Multiple witnesses described encountering Hart during his supply runs to Prospect Gulch and noting his increasingly agitated demeanor when questioned about his mining success. Hart's responses to casual inquiries about his techniques or findings became evasive and defensive, suggesting either paranoia about claim jumping or knowledge of activities that he preferred to keep confidential. Several witnesses recalled Hart's apparent fascination with local history, particularly stories about indigenous activities in the area prior to European settlement. Hart frequently questioned long-term residents about tribal burial grounds, seasonal encampments, or sacred sites that might be located within the current mining district. His interest in these topics seemed academic rather than practical, focusing on historical accuracy rather than potential mining opportunities. This interest in indigenous history correlated with Hart's documented discoveries of unusual artifacts during his excavations. Fellow prospectors who had observed these artifacts described objects that seemed inconsistent with typical indigenous technologies of the region. The items appeared to be tools or ceremonial objects crafted using techniques that required specialized knowledge and considerable time investment. Hart's enthusiasm about these discoveries had initially been shared by some of his fellow prospectors, who viewed them as interesting curiosities with potential value to collectors or museums in established settlements. However, Hart's possessive attitude toward the artifacts and his reluctance to allow detailed examination gradually alienated potential collaborators and contributed to his growing isolation within the mining community. The transformation of Hart's attitude toward his archaeological discoveries paralleled his increasing hostility toward other prospectors in general. Witnesses described a progression from enthusiastic sharing of interesting findings to defensive secrecy about all aspects of his operation. Hart began to view routine social interactions as potential threats to his work, responding to friendly inquiries with suspicion and occasionally with explicit warnings to avoid his claim. This defensive behavior extended to Hart's relationship with territorial authorities, whom he initially contacted to report his archaeological discoveries, but later avoided entirely. Marshal Kane's records indicate that Hart stopped responding to routine visits and began posting warning signs around his claim that threatened legal action against trespassers. These warnings exceeded the normal boundaries of claim protection, extending to areas that were technically public territory. Hart's final documented interaction with territorial authorities occurred in November 1855, when he filed a formal complaint alleging systematic harassment by fellow prospectors who were allegedly attempting to drive him from his claim. The complaint described a campaign of intimidation that included nighttime visits, sabotage of his equipment, and threats of violence if he continued his archaeological activities. Investigation of Hart's allegations revealed no corroborating evidence of the harassment he described. Fellow prospectors denied any knowledge of organized efforts against Hart, and physical examination of his claim revealed no signs of sabotage or vandalism. Marshal Kane concluded that Hart's complaints reflected growing paranoia rather than actual persecution, but the detailed nature of his allegations suggested either elaborate fabrication or genuine experiences that could not be verified. Hart's complaint included specific descriptions of individuals whom he claimed to have observed conducting surveillance of his operations. These descriptions provided physical details and behavioral patterns that seemed too specific to be entirely fictional, yet no residents of the mining district matched Hart's descriptions of the alleged harassers. This discrepancy raised questions about Hart's mental state and his ability to distinguish between actual events and paranoid fantasies. The complaint also revealed Hart's belief that his archaeological discoveries had attracted attention from organizations or individuals with resources far exceeding those of typical frontier criminals. Hart wrote of being approached by representatives of unnamed groups who offered to purchase his findings for sums that seemed dramatically disproportionate to their apparent value. He described these individuals as possessing knowledge about the historical significance of his discoveries that they refused to share with him. According to Hart's account, these mysterious purchasers demonstrated familiarity with archaeological sites throughout the Rocky Mountain region, suggesting an organized effort to locate and acquire artifacts from indigenous cultures. Hart claimed that their offers included not only financial compensation, but also promises of academic recognition and assistance in properly documenting his discoveries for scientific purposes. However, Hart's description of these alleged interactions included details that strained credibility. The individuals he described possessed resources and knowledge that would have been extraordinary for the frontier conditions of the mid-1850s. Their apparent ability to travel freely throughout the territory and their access to current archaeological theories suggested affiliations with established institutions that rarely operated in remote mining districts. Most puzzling was Hart's claim that these individuals possessed detailed maps of archaeological sites in areas that had not been systematically explored or surveyed by territorial authorities. The accuracy of their geographical knowledge implied either extensive previous investigation of the region or access to indigenous sources of information that would have required unprecedented cooperation from tribal leaders. Hart's final complaint to territorial authorities included his decision to cease cooperation with these mysterious purchasers due to their refusal to acknowledge his discovery rights or provide guarantees about the proper preservation of the artifacts. He wrote of developing suspicions about their true intentions and their willingness to use illegal methods to acquire archaeological materials from prospectors who proved uncooperative. This decision to reject the offers apparently triggered the harassment campaign that Hart described in his formal complaint. According to his account, the surveillance and intimidation activities began immediately after he terminated negotiations with the would-be purchasers. Hart interpreted this timing as confirmation that the organized groups possessed resources and determination that posed serious threats to his safety and his control over the archaeological site. Hart's increasing paranoia about these alleged threats led to his decision to work exclusively during nighttime hours and to recruit assistance from individuals he described as sharing his commitment to protecting the archaeological integrity of his discoveries. However, Hart provided no identifying information about these allies, referring to them only as associates who understood the historical importance of his findings and who possessed skills necessary to defend the site against outside interference. The ambiguous nature of these alleged associates raises questions about their actual existence and their potential roles in subsequent events at Hart's claim. Hart's descriptions suggest individuals with specialized knowledge about both archaeological techniques and defensive strategies, capabilities that would have been unusual among typical frontier residents. Their willingness to assist Hart without apparent compensation and their ability to maintain secrecy about their involvement implies either extraordinary dedication to archaeological preservation or motivations that Hart chose not to document. The winter of 1855 to 1856 marked the final phase of Hart's documented presence in the Clear Creek County area. The isolation imposed by severe weather conditions provided cover for whatever activities continued at his claim during these months, but also eliminated opportunities for outside observation that might have clarified the nature of those activities. The only evidence of continued operations at Hart's claim during winter months consisted of the distant sounds and occasional light sources reported by other prospectors who had remained in the territory. These observations suggested sustained activity that required coordination among multiple individuals and access to resources that exceeded Hart's documented supplies and equipment. The systematic nature of the winter activities implied planning and preparation that must have occurred during the preceding autumn months. The apparent involvement of multiple individuals suggested either the recruitment of assistants or the arrival of the mysterious associates whom Hart had referenced in his final complaint to territorial authorities. In either case, the activities represented a significant escalation from Hart's previous pattern of solitary work. Spring's revelation that Hart had vanished and his claim had been systematically dismantled indicated that the winter activities had concluded with the complete elimination of evidence about whatever had occurred at the site. The thoroughness of this cleanup suggested either advanced preparation for departure or efforts to conceal activities that participants feared might be investigated by territorial authorities. The discovery of the mass grave 12 years later provided the first concrete evidence that the winter activities at Hart's Claim had involved violence on a scale that exceeded typical frontier conflicts. The systematic burial of multiple victims implied organization and resources that seemed inconsistent with spontaneous criminal activity, suggesting instead a calculated operation that had been planned and executed with considerable care. The correlation between the timing of the burials and Hart's final winter at the Claim raised inevitable questions about his involvement in the deaths of the buried individuals. However, the number of victims and the apparent coordination required for their disposal also suggested that Hart, if involved, had not acted alone in whatever events had led to the mass grave. The investigation of Hart's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of the mass grave remained officially unsolved when territorial status ended and Colorado achieved statehood in 1876. Local authorities filed final reports that attributed the deaths to unknown criminal activity and Hart's disappearance to probable involvement in that activity, either as perpetrator or victim. However, the case continued to generate unofficial interest among historians and archaeologists who became aware of Hart's documented archaeological discoveries and his references to systematic efforts to locate and acquire indigenous artifacts throughout the Rocky Mountain region. These researchers suspected that Hart's case might represent evidence of organized artifact trafficking that operated on a scale previously unknown in territorial records. The sophistication implied by Hart's description of the alleged purchasing organization suggested connections to established institutions with resources for conducting systematic archaeological investigations. The apparent knowledge demonstrated by these individuals about indigenous cultures and archaeological sites implied either extensive previous research or access to specialized expertise that would have been extraordinary for the frontier period. Modern archaeological understanding of indigenous cultures in the Rocky Mountain region supports some aspects of Hart's documented discoveries, particularly his findings of sophisticated tools and ceremonial objects in contexts that suggested long-term occupation and complex social organization. These discoveries were consistent with current knowledge about pre-Columbian cultures, but would have been revelatory to prospectors in the 1850s who possessed little understanding of indigenous technological capabilities. The value that Hart's mysterious contacts apparently placed on these archaeological materials suggests recognition of their historical significance that exceeded typical 19th century attitudes toward indigenous artifacts. This sophisticated appreciation for archaeological evidence implies either academic training or cultural knowledge that would have been unusual among frontier entrepreneurs or criminals operating in remote mining districts. The systematic approach that Hart described in his contacts with alleged purchasing organizations resembles methods that were being developed by legitimate archaeological institutions during the same period, but which were rarely employed in field operations west of the Mississippi River. The apparent coordination between multiple sites throughout the territory suggests resources and organization that exceeded the capabilities of individual researchers or small academic groups. The ultimate fate of Hart's archaeological discoveries remains unknown, as does the identity of the individuals who may have acquired them through legitimate purchase or illegal seizure. The systematic elimination of evidence from Hart's claim suggests either successful concealment of valuable materials or their removal to locations that have never been identified by subsequent investigators. The case of Malcolm Hart represents one of the earliest documented instances of large-scale archaeological investigation in the Colorado Territory, but also one of the most controversial due to the violence and secrecy that apparently accompanied the work. The correlation between archaeological discovery and multiple deaths raises questions about the methods employed by whoever ultimately gained control of Hart's findings and the lengths to which they were willing to go to protect their operations from outside interference. The mass grave, discovered 12 years after Hart's disappearance, serves as a grim reminder that the pursuit of historical knowledge in frontier conditions often involved conflicts and consequences that were concealed from official records. The victims buried near Hart's former claim represent individuals whose identities and circumstances remain unknown, but whose deaths apparently resulted from their involvement in events that participants preferred to hide from territorial authorities. The incomplete nature of the investigation and the destruction of potential evidence ensure that definitive answers about Hart's case will likely never emerge. However, the documented facts provide sufficient detail to establish that significant archaeological discoveries were made in the Clear Creek County area during 1855, and that those discoveries attracted attention from individuals or organizations with resources and motivations that extended far beyond typical frontier commercial interests. The legacy of Hart's case extends beyond its immediate historical significance to raise broader questions about the treatment of indigenous archaeological materials during the territorial period and the methods employed by early collectors to acquire specimens for institutional or private collections. The violence associated with Hart's discoveries suggests that competition for archaeologically significant materials was more intense and more dangerous than contemporary records typically acknowledged. The systematic concealment of evidence related to Hart's case also reflects broader patterns in territorial record-keeping that prioritized economic development and social stability over thorough investigation of criminal activity or archaeological preservation. The willingness of territorial authorities to accept expedient explanations for complex events contributed to the loss of historical information that might have illuminated important aspects of both indigenous history and early archaeological practices in the Rocky Mountain region. Modern efforts to locate Hart's former claim and investigate the archaeological potential of the area have been frustrated by changes in topography due to subsequent mining activities and urban development. The original landscape that Hart documented in his notes has been extensively modified, eliminating physical evidence that might have supported or contradicted his claims about the nature and significance of his discoveries. The documents recovered from Hart's cabin in 1864 represent the primary source of information about his archaeological work and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. These papers, despite their deteriorated condition and Hart's increasingly erratic writing style, provide the only detailed account of what may have been one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Colorado territorial history. The mystery surrounding Malcolm Hart's fate and the ultimate disposition of his archaeological discoveries continues to attract attention from researchers interested in both frontier history and early archaeological practices in the American West. However, the passage of time and the systematic elimination of evidence ensure that Hart's case will likely remain one of the territory's most compelling unsolved mysteries. The sounds that witnesses reported hearing from Hart's claim during his final winter have never been adequately explained, nor have the multiple figures observed moving across the property during nighttime hours. These phenomena, combined with the systematic disposal of evidence and the discovery of the mass grave, suggest that Hart's claim served as the site of activities that participants were determined to conceal from contemporary observation and historical documentation. The winter of 1855 to 1856 in the Rocky Mountains claimed many lives through exposure, accident, and violence, but the organized nature of the deaths associated with Hart's claim distinguishes his case from typical frontier casualties. The care taken in burial procedures and the selection of a concealed location suggests that those responsible possessed both local knowledge and long-term planning capabilities that exceeded the resources of ordinary criminals or desperate prospectors. The complete absence of Hart's personal effects and accumulated wealth from his abandoned claim indicates either successful evacuation of valuable materials or their seizure by individuals who possess the resources and organization necessary to conduct systematic removal operations under harsh winter conditions. The thoroughness of this elimination suggests advanced planning and coordination that required extensive preparation and multiple participants. The territorial marshal's final assessment that Hart had fallen victim to claimed jumpers or hostile Indians reflected the limited investigative resources available to frontier law enforcement and the pressure to provide explanations that discouraged further inquiry into potentially dangerous situations. The acceptance of these explanations by territorial authorities enabled the concealment of evidence about Hart's case that might otherwise have been preserved in official records. The transformation of Hart's personality during his final months from solitary but cooperative prospector to paranoid and defensive individual reflects psychological pressures that exceeded typical frontier stress, suggesting exposure to circumstances or information that fundamentally altered his relationship with his environment and his fellow community members. The specific nature of these pressures remains unclear, but their intensity suggests involvement in activities that carried risks beyond those associated with ordinary mining operations. The archaeological significance of Hart's discoveries, as documented in his personal notes, represents knowledge about indigenous cultures in the Rocky Mountain region that was decades ahead of contemporary understanding. The sophisticated appreciation for these materials demonstrated by Hart's alleged contacts suggests access to specialized expertise that would have required institutional resources or extensive previous experience with similar archaeological investigations. The systematic approach to artifact acquisition that Hart described in his accounts of interactions with mysterious purchasing organizations resembles methods that were being developed by major museums and universities during the same period, but which were rarely employed in field operations in remote territories. This sophistication raises questions about the institutional affiliations of the individuals involved and their motivations for conducting archaeological work under conditions of such extreme secrecy. The ultimate resolution of Hart's case may depend on future archaeological investigations that could potentially locate and examine the sites where he claimed to have made his most significant discoveries. However, the extensive environmental changes that have occurred in the Clear Creek County area since 1855 make such investigations increasingly difficult and unlikely to yield definitive results. The legacy of Malcolm Hart's final winter in the Rocky Mountains serves as a reminder that frontier conditions often concealed activities and events that challenged conventional understanding of territorial history and social organization. The combination of archaeological discovery, systematic violence, and organized concealment represented in his case suggests that competition for valuable resources extended beyond mineral wealth to include cultural materials whose historical significance was recognized by sophisticated operators working outside the boundaries of official territorial oversight. The records remained sealed in territorial archives until 1962, when historian Dr. Margaret Thornfield encountered Hart's file while researching mining disputes for her doctoral dissertation. Thornfield's academic interest transformed into obsession as she uncovered correlations between Hart's case and similar disappearances throughout the Rocky Mountain territories during the 1850s. Her investigation revealed a pattern that territorial authorities had either failed to recognize or deliberately ignored: the systematic disappearance of prospectors who reported archaeological discoveries in regions that later became significant institutional archaeological sites. Thornfield documented at least 12 cases between 1853 and 1859 that shared characteristics with Hart's experience. Initial cooperation with mysterious purchasing agents, followed by isolation, paranoia, and ultimate disappearance. The most disturbing discovery in Thornfield's research concerned the institutional connections of several individuals who had acquired properties adjacent to sites where archaeological discoveries had been reported. Land records revealed that prominent academic figures and museum representatives had purchased mining claims in areas where prospectors like Hart had subsequently vanished, often within months of documented archaeological findings. Thornfield's preliminary report to the Colorado Historical Society in 1963 outlined her suspicions about organized archaeological exploitation during the territorial period. However, her research was interrupted when she received threats warning her to cease investigation into matters that posed risks to established institutional reputations. The threats, delivered through academic channels, referenced potential damage to her career and personal safety if she continued pursuing what correspondents characterized as unfounded conspiracy theories. Dr. Thornfield's final documented research note, dated April 19, 1964, expressed her intention to suspend active investigation while maintaining private files about Hart's case and related incidents. She wrote of recognizing patterns that extended beyond academic competition into areas involving systematic criminal activity, but acknowledged lacking resources to pursue investigation safely or effectively. Margaret Thornfield disappeared during a solo research trip to Clear Creek County in May 1964. Her vehicle was discovered abandoned near Hart's former claim area, with her research materials missing and no evidence of her subsequent whereabouts. The official investigation attributed her disappearance to accident or mishap in difficult terrain, concluding that her remains had likely been carried away by spring flood conditions. The parallels between Thornfield's disappearance and Hart's fate more than a century earlier were noted by several colleagues, but institutional pressure discouraged public discussion of potential connections. The academic community's response emphasized Thornfield's inexperience with wilderness conditions rather than her research into territorial archaeological exploitation, effectively ending scholarly interest in Hart's case for several decades. Today, Malcolm Hart's name appears only in archived territorial records and in Thornfield's incomplete research files, preserved in the Colorado Historical Society's restricted collections. The location of his claim has been absorbed into suburban development, and the mass grave discovered in 1867 lies beneath a shopping center parking lot, unmarked and largely forgotten. The artifacts that Hart died protecting, if they ever existed, have never been located or identified in any known institutional collection. The mysterious purchasing organization that may have orchestrated his final winter remains as anonymous as the individuals whose remains were found buried near his abandoned camp. Sometimes during particularly quiet winter nights in the subdivisions that now occupy Clear Creek County's former mining district, residents report hearing sounds that seem inconsistent with modern suburban life, rhythmic impacts against stone, followed by scraping noises that carry farther than they should in the thin mountain air. These reports are generally attributed to settling foundations or nocturnal wildlife, explanations that satisfy most inquiries. But a few long-time residents remember older stories about the area's history, stories that suggest some activities leave echoes that persist long after their participants have vanished into the archives of territorial justice. Malcolm Hart's final winter may have ended in 1856, But the questions surrounding his discoveries and disappearance continue to disturb the silence of Colorado's high country, waiting for investigators brave enough or foolish enough to seek answers that previous generations chose to bury. The case remains officially closed, filed among thousands of similar territorial-era incidents that reflect the harsh realities of frontier existence. Yet Hart's detailed documentation of archaeological discoveries and his meticulous records of contact with organized acquisition networks suggest that his story represents more than typical frontier tragedy. It may represent one of the earliest documented instances of institutional archaeological exploitation in the American West, conducted by individuals whose identities and affiliations died with them in the unmarked graves scattered throughout Colorado's mining districts. Until someone with sufficient resources and determination chooses to reopen investigation into Hart's claims and Thornfield's research, the truth about what occurred during that final winter in Clear Creek County will remain buried beneath decades of official indifference and institutional protection of reputations that may not deserve preservation. The Rocky Mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes on the coldest winter nights, those secrets stir in the darkness, reminding the living that some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the graves or how complete the silence that follows.